This is the third in the way of the CCA and more public presentations. We've been running quite a lot of these with a lot of the reseller agronomy groups and some independent agronomy groups. So we've had a pretty fair coverage. The contents of the presentation continue to evolve at a rapid rate. I do note that this is actually version 55, just as not because we actually brought some more stuff together today, some last night. So just to kick off with regards to ViVUS and sorghum, we've had ViVUS in the market for 20 years and nothing much has changed. So we had a handful of problem applications last year, and we just thought we'd just follow up on what some of those were, just as a bit of a re-education. So hence the heading of the conversation here is now, what about that 1%? Just to kick off, this will be a text-intensive screen, but it paints a bit of a picture that back in August last year, the outlook was a hot, dry season with a limited planting was going on. Here was the Bureau of Meteorology, this is back in September, talking about the fact that their confidence will last until the end of summer, meaning a continuation of warm and dry conditions. As we know, obviously, we ran into substantial rain. What that did is that gave us a really condensed main planting, which is something unusual. And I'll show you a bit of information later on, which actually really details how intense that planting actually was. The early crop, which was the limited planting, had lots of variability, lots of stress tillers, lots of problems with it. And there was a few adverse outcomes because we had all sorts of different larval sizes through the crops. And there's a technical ag biotech term here, which we refer to regularly as a crap outcome. We then had moderate pressure on the seriously condensed spray window crop, and we had reasonable ViVUS results from there on in. I'd just like to flag this thing around cotton spray drift. And you thought, well, what the hell are we worried about with cotton spray drift issues? It did have an impact on us. So the key three areas that Ian and I have drilled into initially were around these early crops with the variability, the seriously condensed spray window, and the cotton spray drift issues that were out there. Ian, just want to briefly run through what we covered here.
Yeah, sure, Philip. So we had 4 detailed investigations that we did across a multitude of geographical areas, and we put our heads together and started working out what variables impact spray performance, and we came up with 72 different variables. So from that, we excluded most of them. Q&A and the bioassay work from the lab was all good. Storage and handling, most of the time we could rule that out. And as far as we're aware, there is no resistance to the virus at all.
So it's sort of really circulated around the 3 key areas to do with crop coverage and the insects. And historically, there's lots of stuff we can get away with, and we have done. And my AI friend the other day generated that image on the right there. Last season was very much a Swiss cheese year that we had. So if we just jump into that crop that was the early planted, it was really variable, lots of stress, a major spread of maturity, and we had hesitancy in the agronomic base of everybody just to jump on those scattered low numbers of emerged heads that had caterpillars in them, or that red corner of a block that was out in head and the balance of the block wasn't. So one of the key messages, if there's one thing you take away from us today, is the key refresh is go earlier than we've sort of done historically. And when I say go earlier, we're talking about this 10 to 50% flowering. Historically, the work was originally done at 50% flowering. The QDPI recommendation was treating at 50% flowering. Our strong recommendation is to bring this forward to 10 to 50% flowering, even if there's only a few heads to the metre that are physically out and you need to chase the larvae in the heads. So this is where we're talking about positioning ViVUS Max now, is going earlier. But the more variable the stand, the more uneven the stand is, the more earlier you have to go. And there's another ag biotech technical term here about stuffing about. Get stuck into it early on. There's a little bit of an updated slide here, which is telling a bit of a story about how some people got a bit caught last season around the expectations of the growth of Helicoverpa. So this is actually showing across the various respective instars and how long they spend in those respective. So at a daily average temperature of 20 degrees, so that's 15 to 25 degrees, you're looking at, say, 17 to 18 days from egg hatch to actually a 5th instar larvae, which then moves on to maybe 6th or maybe pupates. At 27 degrees, which is much more our summer spraying, which is the absolute Goldilocks zone here, it then brings forward that's time when the larvae get to a large scale by about 4 or 5 days. Now, there are some substantial implications of this. Here is a real-time case study that Ian and I looked into. And if you look across here, the recommendation was from the agro saying mostly third instar with the fourth instar. Keep in mind, we're recommending first and second instar and possibly stretching to third. So we're at the end of the envelope, I suppose, with regards to our label recommendation. But if you look, that was the size of the larvae that was there. Now, what actually happened is that the application went on 3 days late for a multitude of reasons. We're not going to point too many fingers at that. But there is what actually physically happened, that in those 3 days, that those larvae have gone from mostly thirds to mostly fourth instar larvae. We're outside the envelope where we really want to be. But if you notice, this is at 20 degrees C, and the reality was it was actually at on average of 27. So this is 22 to 31 degrees. And the recommendation there was third with the odd fourth instar, but the reality was they were mostly fourth instar with the odd fifth instar by such time as the spray went on. Now, given the fact that the larger larvae take longer to die, we're actually seeing larvae which were actually fifth instar larvae before they were dying. So whilst the agronomist was out there saying, I've got third instar larvae, spray it and walked away from the job, the reality was we had a crop that was actually chock-a-block full of fifth instar larvae, then they're getting their death. So putting this into concept, I suppose, of what we're trying to achieve here with actually going with first and second instar. This was the current situation that happened with that particular farm. But if we were to change this over and actually looked at this to actually chasing first instar with the odd second instar, that was the application window there. So it was actually, by the time they got it on, it was seconds with the odd thirds, which meant that the death of the larvae happened earlier, so mostly the third instar larvae. Now, the really beautiful part about this is that the epizootic infections then start to roll on, which then go on to continue to roll through the crop. So we're not actually getting damage. The damage we get is actually minute compared to the amount of damage that we're getting. Again, we end up in a situation where, in this case, we will get epizootic deaths that roll on through the crop after that application. We didn't get anybody this year where we had a situation where they went too early and we got a poor job from that. We got so many poor jobs from people going too late. So hence bringing this spray threshold earlier to 10 to 50% flowering and kill the larvae in the nurseries. We also had a couple of jobs pop up where they had not such good outcomes that were methanol mixes. And the question was, why would we be getting methanol mix issues? Nothing's changed. The larvae are still susceptible to virus as they always physically have. The virus is perfectly fine. So what was it? We had a real penny drop moment, is that once you sit down and there's a bit of honesty comes from the consultant, you then found that they were actually trying to chase some large pythons in the crop and a whole lot of larger larvae. So things were way out of shape with where they physically should have been. So there was no problems at all with regards to the product mix. It was just way too late when it was physically applied. So, but the reality is, as we all know, the spraying often and regularly happens in substandard conditions. You can't all be sprayed in a timely manner. So there is always going to be a range of this, and as an agronomist, you need to be absolutely aware of the fact that when you've made the recommendation, that there can be a delay or problems getting it on. Our good old friend, the Delta T. Ian, did you just want to talk through just a little bit about the Delta T? I know the industry's done it to death, but it can't hurt just to revisit this.
Yeah, sure. So what we found was, in the majority of the situations where they didn't get a desirable outcome or as good an outcome that they would have liked, the Delta T was way out of whack. So if you look at, 30 to 35 degrees with high humidity, something like you get in far north Queensland or Kununurra, you can get away with it. But if you've still got 30 to 35 degrees and low humidity, so something that you would probably find in the southern areas like Hillston, Hay, places like that, that's where the spraying conditions weren't ideal, and there's not a lot of time during the day where they can actually get it on.
So another investigation where we looked into here, this was in the more southern areas, was actually, this is actually a 2-week period with maximum and minimum temperatures, and there's a little bit of rainfall in there. If you go through and you take out the minimum temperatures, and then you look across the board here and you add in the relative humidity, You find that over that 2-week period at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and everyone says, oh, you shouldn't be spraying at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. We all know this is reality. There was really only 3, maybe 4 days out of that 2-week period where the conditions of the humidity was high enough for the delta T to be high enough that made it reasonable spraying. But if you look down below, they were the days when it was actually showering rain. So the reality is that spray happening occurs. It all can't be sprayed in a timely manner, but if you're thinking that there will be troubles with it getting it on, from a spray drift direction issues, from getting hold of a contractor to an aircraft getting delayed, be aware of it, allow for it, and go with larger larvae. One of the other critical things that's cropped up this year is we found a few people that are so comfortable with using ViVUS, they haven't been going back in to recheck at day 4 or day 3, just to make sure they're getting an effect. Some things can be going wrong. The application may not go on, but you need to be all over that very, very quickly after the application to make sure you're getting a job. We're talking about water rates and water coverage. Here's some water sensitive paperwork that was done, and this came off the Spray Systems website originally. And if I were to put these up here with water sensitive paper showing 45 litres per hectare on the right and 125 litres per hectare, 45 litres on the left and 125 litres per hectare on the right, that would be perhaps as you expected. If you were to actually look at what this actually really was, and there's a bit of animation here, I normally don't use animation, but when you actually look at it, it wasn't what you might think it was. The 45 litres per hectare was actually 125 litres per hectare and vice versa. What we're saying here is that even with below label water rates, not that we will recommend this, you're far better off going with a fine droplet pattern than a very coarse droplet pattern. Because what we're trying to achieve and what the label is asking us to do is 100 litres of water per hectare with fine and medium droplets at the very worst. So that's a really, really critical thing, and we'll just come back to that in a minute. And hence the question around cotton spray drift issues that I've brought up. The cotton industry has been very, very vocal with regards to phenoxy drift, and also now moving into extend flax with dicamba. They're very, very sensitive and been doing a great job with actively reminding people about spray drift issues. As a result, there is a very high proportion of growers these days which are using air induction nozzles, and these are, quote, ideal for a wide variety of systemic herbicides and applications where drift control is critical. Now, for fear of Philip Armitage getting disavowed from the cotton industry, heaven forbid, we really need to work with growers and applicators to stop them using air induction nozzles with products like ViVUS, like Dipel, like fungicides, like contact herbicides, because they give you terrible outcomes. Here was another case study that Ian and I looked into where we had a grower who used 50 litres of water to the hectare. The label rate's 100 litres, and they were using the 11002 air induction nozzles at 3.5 bar. What that's given them when you actually look at the spray systems chart here is it gives you coarse to very coarse droplets. When you put that on that chart at 50 litres per hectare or 45, that's the sort of coverage that they were getting. Even at 100 litres of water at the hectare, they're still getting this very poor coverage. So what we're coming back to, this is what we're trying to do. Now, the other piece of information, I suppose, which in chatting with Anthony Boys yesterday, we had a bit of a chat. One of the things is that droplets seriously matter when you are getting outside that first instar larvae size. When you're getting second, you're getting third instars. Droplet size absolutely matters. Maybe the droplet size is not so critical if you're going on first instars, but when you're starting to chase second and third instar larvae, the droplet size becomes absolutely critical. The reality is also that operators are really reluctant to change nozzles, and they will give you lip service. The reality is, not changing nozzles, but saying I'm putting on more water does not necessarily give you better coverage. But as Ian will say, more droplets on the plant will give you more feeding sites. So the critical thing here, as an agronomist in the paddock, you need to be aware. Get back in the field at day 3 to 4 to confirm everything's gone on, just to double check. 99% of the time, we don't see any problems crop up. But if you do, you will pick it up at day 3 or day 4. Just touching on the threshold, and if you're chasing first and second instar larvae, heaven forbid a chemical manufacturer was going to advise you only need to be using 75 mils of ViVUS Max if you're chasing first and second instars, which means the threshold on these is 2 to 3 larvae per head. That's at $300 to $350 a tonne. It's only 2 to 3 larvae per 10 heads, so it's very, very low levels. We just need to also mention that if you're sampling and you're using a bucket please don't flog the heads from side to side in the bucket against the sides, because what that is doing, that's actually crushing the first and second instar larvae against the grain. They stick to the grain and they don't fall into the bucket, and you'll actually significantly underrepresent the numbers of first and second instars in it. Another question that came up, it's come through us regularly, is we're being asked about epizootic effects. And I do love these bits of agronomy porn here at the moment. So I'm not supposed to use that word. These lovely, juicy agronomy slides. The spread of ViVUS through the environment is done by other insects. It's spread by rain splash. It's spread by cannibalism, and it's also spread by the wind. Things like ants are actually very good at walking the stuff around all over the place. This is a statistic that if you have one medium, that's a third instar larvae per square metre, that's 200 to 300 times the amount of viruses you can apply by a boom spray. Putting that into perspective, one dead medium to the square metre is equivalent to 45 litres of ViVUS per hectare. Just let that sink in. One of the things is that whilst the virus is there, in 40 degrees Celsius with 10% humidity, there's a lot of desiccation of the cadavers. It still means that it still will spread, but this is why you'll see the enhanced spread of ViVUS through the environment when you get these overcast, you get this showery weather, you get very dewy mornings and those sorts of things, because the caterpillar stays gooey. I suppose our friend Murillo, who's here from Brazil, this is a normal day for him with lots of showery rain through the growing season. But on the Western Downs or Western New South Wales, you'll see more of the dried up cadavers, but they are still effective in actually spreading the virus purely on a numbers game. The other thing too, just we needed to talk about, which made this year very, very unusual, is the amount of background NPV in the environment. So one of the things that we note in a normal year, whatever a normal year is, and places like the eastern end of the Downs, at the beginning of the season, which might be in October, November, the spraying starts. And by the time we get into January, February, there's very limited ViVUS spraying going out, because the environment is an absolute wash of native, natural and NPV and physically in the environment. Now, these are our sales numbers, which will be not these are the numbers which have been the products being reported to be used in, but the actual application would have gone on the month before. So if you want to look back from 2008, you see this wild variability on a month. But if I were to put in this year just gone, this is what that condensed plant looked like. So there was a huge volume of ViVUS went out in January, which means there wasn't a volume that went out in October, November and December, which sort of figures. But that meant that we didn't have this tailwind of natural background and infection that was going on out in the environment. I just want to touch on the virus degradation that's out there, and this has also come up in a couple of instances talking particularly to growers. pH. So one of the things, these ball-like substances you can see on the screen there are what they call occlusion bodies, and this is what the virus is contained inside, and this is what the caterpillar ingests. Once the virus is inside the caterpillar, these occlusion bodies dissolve. Now, part of the breakdown of these is in high pH. The gut of the Helicoverpa and also Fall Armyworm is an alkaline gut. So when you actually end up with a spray solution that might be a pH of 8.5 or 9, that breakdown of these occlusion bodies is actually sort of started. So this is why we recommend, if you've got high pH spray solutions, always add a buffer. That'll actually slow this down. There's been wild claims out there about certain products are more stable in high pH, which is absolutely rot, because if you've got an occlusion body which is more stable in high pH solution, it means it's much more stable inside the caterpillar. The next breakdown is UV light. So exposed on a leaf blade after about 48 hours, the UV light is largely broken down the virus. The virus is DNA, and the natural enemy of viruses is UV light. After about 48 hours, anything that's on an exposed leaf blade is largely broken down. And the more important point here, we just needed to reinvigorate everybody with, was around temperature. So to misquote our friend Kenny, at 4 degrees and below, ViVUS will outlast religion with regards to its storability at 4 degrees and below. It's perfectly fine down to minus 20 degrees. When we're looking at 25 degrees Celsius, it's sort of 6+ months. And this is why when it's sitting on the plant, because the plant is transpiring and the plant is somewhere between 22 to 25, 26 degrees Celsius. If the virus is out of sight from UV light, it's actually pretty stable on the plant. If you can get it inside the head, it's also quite stable. If we're shipping it overnight, or if you need to store it for a week or 10 days in an air-conditioned office, then that's fine. But what actually happens is when you start to get from 30 to 40 degrees Celsius, that breakdown is very high risk. And once you get over 40 degrees, it is very, very rapid with the degradation. It's a matter of literal hours it gets broken down. So the trick is treat it when you're handling it like ice cream. You can use a freezer, it doesn't hurt it. You can store it at -20. It's still pourable at -20. It just gives you a bit of extra spare cold. So what we didn't get away with this year, it's just back to the ViVUS fundamentals. It's around the crop, it's around the coverage, and it's around the insects. Now, so one of the things with regards to fall armyworm in sorghum is that there's a real gap with regards to our knowledge base. It's a new pest. We've only had it for 3 going on 4 years now. Working with QDPI, who were QDAF, who were QDPI. They have a lot of work that's being done, but they haven't actually got anything which they can really publish out there. They're not exactly sure of the science. So we felt that it was a good opportunity for us to pull together what we could learn out there. So I'd just like to recognise that the QDPI team, particularly Melina Miles, who sat beside me in the office for many hours going through things, throwing rocks at what I pulled together. Also Joe Eyre, New South Wales DPI, some of the independent crop consultants and growers themselves. But also I'd like to note Anthony Hawes. Anthony's our Chief Technology Officer and founder. He sat in this office even yesterday and gave me several hours of his time going through this just to make sure that what we've pulled together is best knowledge at the moment. And I'd also like to thank the Ag Biotech Brazil technical team as well for some of their input. And part of that, we've got Murillo here today as well. So you'll live first time for Ag Biotech. Here is a disclaimer. And this is what we've pulled together from research as concisely as we can. This information is changing daily. We don't mean it for it to be a final recommendation. Heaven forbid this is version 55 of this presentation already. Use your discretion and get more information as it relates to your own information, and always check your labels and the permits which are out there. So this is an updated slide we've got here at the moment, and this is the work that was done by CSIRO and Plant Health Australia about the suitability of fall armyworm in Australia. So the orange area here is the analogue region of Brazil, effectively, which is in the far north. And this is a place where fall armyworm are going to be present all year round in big numbers continually. And excuse my pronunciation if I get this wrong, Murillo. Fall armyworm is known as Legata ducato. How do I pronounce that, Murillo? Help me out.
It was excellent. Lagarta do cartucho.
Cartucho. Thank you, cartucho. So that's what it's called over there, which translates to us as caterpillar of the whirl. And if in Brazil, Forlagen is actually sold in Brazil as a product called Cartigen as a result of that. So whilst we're calling it here, we're calling it Forlagen, they call it Cartigen as a reflection of the fact of what it's physically known. So the analogue region here for the yellow region here, which is where it's present in all seasons, apart from probably the deepest part of the winter, probably arguably, and even then in low numbers, is probably an analogue of the southern Brazil and also in the US. So in the US, it's known as fall armyworm, but it's also known as headworm in the US. And then we've got these rest of these areas where we saw, like in the Darling Downs this year, and the bottom end of central Queensland. We will see it that in some years it's likely to be a problem, and some years it's not. And I think this relates to when the crop is. The feedback we have from Melina is that the further into the season you go, the more chance you will have problems with fall armyworm and sorghum, and the more south you go, the less chance you're going to physically have it there. And I think that's a really, really critical thing. Sorghum is not an optimum host, and I've got permission to share this data from DPI. And this is when you actually lock in a cage, you lock moths in a cage, you give them maize, sorghum, peanuts, pigeon peas, and cotton. This is where they lay their eggs on. They have a very high preference for maize and not so much on sorghum. That doesn't mean that they won't lay eggs on it. Further, the actual sorghum itself is not so much of an optimum host. The top line here is the proportion of the larvae which survive through to pupation. Second line here is the numbers which actually survive through to third instar. You can see it dropping off, but the really telling one for me is the larval weight. You can see that fall armyworm that are growing and surviving on sorghum are just not thriving. The larval weight is just well back on what it is like with it. So sorghum is not an optimum host. So when you tie these things together, you'll find that the larvae are not thriving, it's not overly attractive, and they are very, very susceptible to parasitism. The larvae which come from eggs within the crop seem to be the viable target rather than the larvae which have bred up off the field and walked in as larger larvae. This is a comment that's come from DPI. It's the delayed and late tillers are the primary nurseries of bigger larvae. So if you put that into the context of last season where we had very high levels of variability in these northern areas, this is where the larvae were actually are hiding. Unlike Heelys, which are much more light tolerant, fall armyworms physically aren't. And fall armyworm are really hard to scout that way. The only way to find them is you have to destructively scout those tillers which are not flowering. You need to pull them apart because that's where those larvae are going to be. So the key question we've got is 2023 new normal, or is it atypical driven by that season that we had last year? Again, just coming back to this concept that we had central Queensland was very heavily hit with fall armyworm. The northern part of the Darling Downs actually got a reasonable amount of pressure as well. But given the data we've had, this is the question that we've got. So 20, 21, 22, very limited pressure. 23, this is where we ended up with the problem areas that we had. So just moving through into where and when are you likely to run into troubles? And obviously we're past planting at the moment, but this is the best thinking we have at the moment. Your yield potential is obviously set at stand establishment. I'm sorry to be telling you to suck egg here. However, once you get those sorghum seedlings past that 6 leaf stage, they are then not as susceptible to the large larvae. But prior to that, sorghum will be treated by fall armyworm very, very similarly to the maize. They'll just nip it off of the ground, or if it gets bigger, by the mode of burrowing into that whirl, it'll physically kill the larvae. If you are going to have to treat, consider using a non-selective, because one of the best things you've got out there are your beneficial insects. Be aware of some of the selective chemistries are not selective. The fall armyworm are really, really vulnerable at this stage to parasitism, so you don't want to be putting anything out there which is going to upset that. So some products, like say Success Neo, for example, is very, very soft and everything apart from Trichogramma, Microhymenoptera. They're your egg parasitoids. Something like Steward is very, very hard on things like predatory bugs, for example, but very soft in everything else. Consider a band spray, and remember that the large larvae, you're only going to find them in the crop at night. So those who are bug checkers, you're going to see I'm talking about maybe going out scouting with a torch, heaven forbid, that'll extend your day out to 18 to 20 hours a day. Never mind. Okay, moving through to the vegetative phase, which is where we're at here at the moment. And this is what the current thinking is, that leaf defoliation does not equate to yield loss. But note, I've got an asterisk here. It's an important thing to remember. So, excluding irrigated sorghum, which there's very, very limited amounts of, where you've got light is the limiting factor, not moisture. But in dry land, it really is, the crop can take a huge hammering from defoliation. The work which DPI came with back showed that there was 1.2 large larvae. So we're talking 4th and 5th instar larvae per plant down at Gatton. That's the January, February plantings. And at this time of the year, there was no yield limiting from 0.2 to 0.7 of a large larvae. We're not talking small larvae here, per plant. This is important to remember. The only caveat with this, and hence we had that asterisk, is that with a prolonged infestation over 2 to 3 weeks at that 4 to 6 leaf stage of the continual defoliation can associate things with a yield loss for you. But it is those moisture stressed and the late tillers that are the nurseries for fall armyworm, more so than the lead tiller on the crop. So again, even plants that have come up in good moisture are nowhere near as prone to something that's really struggled or running out of moisture and it's put out late tillers or there's been late rainfall. So just to talk about the fall armyworm foliage ingestion. So here's the growth chart we've actually got. Most of the defoliation is done by 6th instar larvae in the last 4 days of their life. If you actually look at that, look at the respective amounts of plant material that they're consuming, most of that is in the last 4 days of its life. These instars, 1st through to 5th instars, larvae are extremely susceptible to parasitism. Remember, they're not growing and thriving as well. Whilst they are entrenched, they are really, really prone to predation through from things like predatory shield beetles and those sorts of things, which are very, very active and large larvae parasites. Things like technic flies will lay eggs on them. That tends to not kill them until such time as they pupate. And that's another whole story that's there. So this changed yesterday, the recommendation we've got around here. So when we're talking about ViVUS, we're talking about putting into the ViVUS at that 10 to 50% flowering. Fall armyworm potentially will push further out. Just remembering that regardless, if you're chasing Helicoverpa, go early, regardless of the plant stand and the maturity. The fall armyworm, the late tillers are the primary host. Remember, they're not daylight active, and you must be doing destructive sampling that's in here. But it comes back to this fact, which keeps on coming up, that they have very, very high levels of mortality in sorghum. So if you're sub-threshold on fall armyworm, treat the Helicoverpa and go early, because you're going to utilise that mortality that you've got. If you're near threshold on the fall armyworm, the second to third instars that are in the heads, which is a bit unusual, but you may find them in heads, recheck them the following day or recheck them 2 days later, because that parasitism is incredibly high. So when you're doing this, you need to be very, very cognizant of the fact that you will be finding crop plants and tillers which will have had damage done to them, and you'll think there's a caterpillar in there. You've got to do the destructive sampling to go and find them, because you will find quite a large number of vacated feeding sites. This was in maize, and this is some work which Melina shared with me the other day. Out of nearly 1,500 plants, damaged plants that appeared to have caterpillars in them, nearly 30% of them didn't on going through and actually doing the destructive sampling. So you can't make good decisions based on without sampling it. So the considerations. The Vandercourt permit has now been extended. It's now extended through to October 25, which takes the pressure off. And emamectin, just a word of warning with regards to emamectin, if you're out there playing around with wanting to use some wizard, for example, be aware that it is incredibly hard on the beneficials that do most of the heavy lifting with regards to fall armyworm, particularly the predatory bugs. In some ways, it is no better than a synthetic pyrethroid that's out there. ViVUS, on the other hand, has no impact on any of those. So if you're actually chasing Heelys, you're not going to upset them, and neither does Forlagen. We'll come back to Forlagen again in a minute. So the take home, another take home for you, is if you're sub-threshold on the large instar of fall armyworm, then chase the Heelys to avoid tracing your beneficials. Use ViVUS, and removing the Heelys out of the system, you can potentially improve the fall armyworm mortality through changing the predator-to-prey ratio. But critically, please, you've got to come back and monitor. This is a really important thing with this, because we're still understanding this pest. And if we were to run this presentation again tomorrow, it might have updated on this front. This is the best thinking that we've managed to extract from everybody at the moment. Right, I just wanted to talk with regards to a threshold for fall armyworm, and this is something I've spent a lot of time, particularly with me and Melina, on trying to work out how in the hell do we do this. So with regards to the Helicoverpa threshold, the assumption is that the Helicoverpa will eat about or damage 2.4 grams of grain, okay? The assumption that we've physically made is that with fall armyworm that they're going to do similar amounts of damage. And talking with Anthony yesterday, the work that's been done in the US would potentially confirm that they're doing 2.4 grams of grain. The mode of action's a little bit different at times, because the larger larvae will nip the grain off at the pedicel. When the grain gets past soft dough to hard dough, they will nip it off, trying to chase the sugars in the pedicel the last minute. So they can do some grain damage by putting grain on the ground. Again, I can't but reiterate this, you've got to scout the vegetative tillers. And in this instance, to get a threshold, you've got to do a meter's worth of vegetative tillers and convert that to the number of fall armyworm per tiller. That way you can actually compare apples with apples when we're talking Heelys and we're talking fall armyworm. So if you're working off these thresholds here, if you've got 2 to 3 larvae per 10 heads with Heelys, that's your economic threshold for spraying with ViVUS. If you've got 7 to 10 fall armyworm per 10 heads, so pretty much up to 1 per head, it only then becomes economic to spray with Vandercourt or with Wizard emamectin benzoate. We'll organise after this to make sure we actually circulate this bit of information to everybody. But there's your threshold. But keep in mind that by taking the Heelys out, who will persist very strongly on sorghum heads, by taking them out, the fall armyworm who are not strong and don't persist terribly on the heads may fall away very, very quickly as the parasitism swings and gets its focus very much on them. Ian, did you want to give a bit of a quick run through with this stuff? I've been doing most of the talking here.
Yeah, sure. So obviously when we're looking at ViVUS with Helicoverpa, application. So with both caterpillars anyway, application at time when they're most active is really, really important. So with Helicoverpa, if you've got early season crop and low temperatures overnight, you want to try and spray after the daytime temperatures have been above about 18 degrees for a couple of hours. And that's because below 18 degrees, the Helicoverpa caterpillar really slows down on feeding. Below 15, they slow down even more. And below 11, they basically cease. So being an ingested product, we need to apply when they're most active. So Fall Armyworm, with say Forlagen or any other conventional chemistry for that matter, I have seen some jobs where consecutive sprays have been done in the morning, chasing Fall Armyworm, and then another spray has been done in the afternoon on a neighbouring field, and it was chalk and cheese. The one that was sprayed later in the afternoon performed better. So once again, Fall Armyworm aren't actively feeding during the day, so we want to try and target them with the chemistry. So when they're most active, which is at night. So where possible, for Fall Armyworm, spray at night. With the coverage, once again, we need really good coverage, regardless of what you're using. And yeah, scout at night to see your beneficials. So as Philip said, get the headlamp on and away you go.
Not going to be a popular move, but anyway, yes. Yeah. Thanks, Sam. So the questions come up with regards to Forlagen into sorghum. So when we managed to get an import permit for Forlagen, there was great rejoicing because we had a ViVUS that was equivalent that was going to work on Fall Armyworm. The reality was not that. So as a performer, it really struggles to have the Helicoverpa virus type performance. So the question's been asked with regards to where does it fit, and we're still really finding our way with this at the moment. Just a little bit of a background with regards to what we're doing with Forlagen, because the results that we actually get in the laboratory with the laboratory-made Forlagen are better than the results that we get in the factory. We've been continually improving the manufacturing process to see if we can get better in performance, and we're finding that the product which we're working coming through at the moment is actually significantly better than the original Forlagen we physically had out there, and it will be branded Forlagen Evo when we get registration. Hopefully we get registration through, but it will be Forlagen Evo is what it'll be called. So it is better. It's still not good. If we're talking 10, 20, 30% with Forlagen, we're talking 20, 30, 40% with Forlagen Evo. It still must be ingested. And one more thing we're actually seeing in the plots where we've been using the new material that's out there is we're actually starting to see epizootic effects, like the photo there on the left. We're actually starting to see it. And it seems to be mainly in sorghum more so than we're seeing it in maize. So that's a little bit of cause for excitement, particularly when Melina Miles sends me photos like this, Forlagen treated sorghum down in her trial plots at the moment. And there's nothing better than those larger gooey caterpillars. Now, we're not for a moment suggesting you should expect that sort of level of control with Forlagen on Fall Armyworm, and certainly not with the new material, but it is very encouraging that we're actually starting to see epizootic effects, which we haven't seen in the earlier constructs. From a resistance management perspective, and I know Murillo is going to talk about this with regards to Brazil, it's going to be a critical tool with managing this beast if you can get it into the caterpillars. The thing I'm just going to ask at the moment is if there's anybody who wants to have a play around, if you've got some low levels of Fall Armyworm out there and you've got Heelys, if anybody wants to try a bit of Forlagen, just let me know and I'll give you a bit of product to have a play with. We were really, really interested in commercial scale work. Just let us know. If you think it's coming up, let us know and we make sure we get some Forlagen out to the nearest reseller or out into the reseller stores to make sure there's some physically there available. If you'd like to have a play, we'd love you to have a play with it. It's going to help our information base. The fly in the ointment we have is midge. So if we're chasing midge late season, which is when Fall Armyworm is going to be at their worst, we're also going to run into troubles because if we put a synthetic pyrethroid across the crop, we're going to take out all the parasitoids and predators. So that is a bit of a problem. The only thing we can suggest in here at the moment is if you're going in with a midge spray, is just chuck some ViVUS or Forlagen in for the fun of it, for good luck, and just see what we can physically do. We haven't got any data on this at the moment, but this was the latest thinking, I suppose, which Anthony came up. Critically, Fall Armyworm is much harder to physically target, and I think complete insecticide resistance is a real risk. Murillo's got a couple of slides in a couple of minutes just to talk through at the moment. but potentially because it has been so hard to physically target, because it spends so much of its time entrenched, it gets exposure to low doses of critical insecticides, which really then enhances its progression towards developing resistance. Murillo, I can probably drive this from here. I'll probably hand over to you, and thank you very much for dialing in your evening.
Okay, Felipe, thank you for the invite and sorry for my English. I hope you guys understand my English. First of all, I would like to say that Spodoptera frugipera fall armyworm is by far the most important caterpillar in Brazil. It represents around 6% of Brazilian market for caterpillars, which is now $1.2 billion. So it's in the past 2 years, it becomes the worst problem, especially because of the resistance, not just for chemicals, but either for biotechnology as well. If you pass the slide, Felipe. So it's do one click, Felipe. So it's if you look at the corn here in Brazil, this is Viptera corn with biotech Viptera. So it's you normally now we're spraying 7 to 9 sprays per season just to manage fall armyworm in corn, and it is not just corn caterpillar anymore. It is a crop system problem because it happens in soybeans, it's happened in cotton, and fall armyworm has been a huge problem. If you pass the slide, Felipe, you see that the chemicals. There is another slide, Felipe, please. We have already 45 active ingredients that's being presented to be resistant for fall armyworm. Just in Brazil, another slide, Felipe. It's just 17 of those. It happens in Brazil. Already was discovered in Brazil, so it's been very, very challenging to really manage this problem in Brazil. Another one, Felipe. And sorry for this slide is in Portuguese, but the idea here is that each line represents one population of resistance fall armyworm for each of those chemicals. What we can see that there's no cross resistance with NPV, which is cartridge here that we sell. So that's a really incredible tool to manage all this resistance problem that we are facing in Brazil, either for biotechnology or either for a chemical problem. And what we are doing in Brazil now, we are treating in a range of 5 million hectares just with cartridge to manage a fall armyworm. The next slide, Philip. So what we can see, either if you apply whatever chemical that we mix cartridge with those chemicals, we can see a huge increase of control. So we can really deliver to grower a better control with a higher performance, with their low cost, and then we can save the chemicals that's still working to manage the fall armyworm in Brazil, to really doing resistance management in Brazil. So this is pretty much why we are being well success in Brazil managing fall armyworm with cartridge. I think that's it from my side, Philip.
The critical question is what does this current year hold for us with regards to fall armyworm in sorghum? We don't know. There is some light pressure at the moment, and there was a little bit of pressure earlier on, but it seems to have fallen away. Whether we'll see it in central Queensland as vicious as we did this year just gone, I'm not too sure. But yeah, just flow the floor open for any questions, and then we will close off the meeting. Yeah. Thank you very much, everybody. We really appreciate everybody coming along for this, and I think you've got the most up-to-date version at the moment. We will be making this version available online as being the most current version, and we thank you very much for your support. Please, the offer's there if you want to have a bit of a play. I just saw a text come through from someone just a moment ago. If you want to have a little bit of a play with a bit of foraging in sorghum, please let me know. In the meantime, here's happy spraying, and go early and don't go too often. Thank you very much, everybody.